Well, hey, friends, welcome back to the Faith Driven Leader, where we explore how to live with wisdom and purpose and integrate faith into every corner of our work. Today's guest is Joanna Meyer. Joanna is the Director of Public Engagement and the founder of Women, Work, and Calling Initiative at the Denver Institute for Faith and Work. I don't know if you've heard of the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, but if you've not, you need to check them out. They're doing some amazing work in the space of the integration of faith and work, as you might suspect, based on their name. Joanna herself, she's a writer, she's a speaker, she's a convener who brings together theological depth. You're going to hear that in the conversation, and real world insight to one of the most vital questions facing faith-driven professionals today, which is, what does calling look like in the complexity of real life? And in this episode, we talk about all kinds of great stuff. We talk about why are so many Christians struggling to connect their faith to their daily work, what calling really is and how to find freedom when we define it. How do women especially lead with confidence and clarity, and this concept of relational generosity, and why the gospel gives us not just permission but purpose to show up fully in the workplace. Joanna's book is called Women, Work, and Calling, and it's a powerful guide. It's a quick read, powerful guide to living faithfully in today's really fast-changing world. And this conversation is full of insight and encouragement. You're going to love it. Let's dive in. Hey, Joanna Meyer, I am so excited to talk to you today. And I read your book, Women, Work, and Calling, which is on my shelf here behind me. And I've got some questions about the book and some things for us to explore. So thank you so much for joining us on Faith Driven Leader.
It is a treat to be with you, and what an honor. Anytime someone takes time to read the book, I just feel like it's a gift of their attention. So thanks.
Oh, absolutely. Well, a lot of what we try to focus on this show is how can we learn how how faith-led leaders are applying their faith in
Mhm.
their career, in their role, in their, whether that's their professional role or sometimes even their personal roles. So I just think there's so much richness in what you captured in that book, but also when I really kind of reflect on what you've learned through the Denver Institute for Faith and Work,
Mhm.
like you've got so much wisdom to share with us. So I'm really excited to hear what you're going to share with us today.
Awesome.
So I always love to start off by asking people to tell me what their personal definition of leadership is and how
Mm.
that integrates with faith.
A leader is someone who stewards their influence and resources. I tend to be very generous in how I describe leadership because, in the space that I work in, working with a lot of Christian women, I think people are hesitant to call themselves a leader, or there's some women in aspects of the conversation that would say, "Oh, I'm a worker, but I'm not a leader." And I think,
Yeah.
anyone that's intentionally stewarding their influence for a specific purpose is someone that is exerting leadership, and it comes in all
Yeah.
shapes and sizes.
Yeah, I love that. That concept of intentionality that you mentioned and the concept of stewardship has come up a lot when I've asked people that question about what leadership is. And I think it's actually a hallmark of faith-led leaders to think about leadership in that way. I don't
Yeah.
see that in the kind of the non and I wouldn't say secular is necessarily non-faith driven, but my point being folks who aren't like regularly integrating their faith into their leadership don't necessarily think about it as stewardship and
Oh,
stewarding
yeah.
this gift that we've got and the influence that we've got and the resources that we've got because we sit in the roles that we sit in. And to your point, those aren't always positional leadership roles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I love that definition. I love that definition. So I know you've done so much work with faith-led professionals through the Denver Institute, and
Yeah.
I just was wondering, are there some common challenges that you see faith-led leaders
Mm.
facing? Like, what are some of the most common things that come up, and what's the encouragement or equipping that you would give folks around some of those?
Yeah, there's probably a few common themes. One starts just at the biblical foundation, where people who are leading in across industries may not have a foundation of faith that speaks into the reality of their life. They may not be hearing that at church, or they may not have been introduced to a big vision of the gospel, which means that our work is a place in which God's kingdom grows and thrives. And when that's missing, you are left with kind of an instrumental view of work, meaning work is only a means to an end. And for a Christian, that might be work as a place of evangelism, work as a place to earn money and give, all which are really good things, or work as a place for ethical living or expressing your values to how you live. Those are part of the Christian life and what it means to be working faithfully. But I think it's a bigger picture when you situate those means to an end into this vision of life with God lived in service to others, and the unfolding work of Christ's renewing all things. When that applies to any workplace or industry, it really changes how you see that. And so for some people, that's the issue, is that they've never been introduced to that. That's why organizations like Denver Institute and my work with Women Working Calling exist. Some of them I think are very real. It's the complexity of modern life, of a rapidly changing workplace, the pressures of trying to balance work and home. I think many corporate settings are not designed to support the realities of either mothers or fathers or people who are caring for aging parents. Anyone with caretaking responsibilities is feeling the tension of living an integrated life these days. And I think some of it too is just thinking about, what does it look like to have an authentic Christian presence in an increasingly secular culture. I'm here in Denver, Colorado, and it's a very secular culture out here. And so people may think that faith doesn't have a place in the workplace. I would argue it does, but it takes a level of savvy and nuance in how you choose to live it out.
Yeah. I want to dig on a couple of those because those are so good, and I hear those a lot. The first one, you talked about this foundation of that our work is actually, I use the phrase sometimes that our work is worship.
Oh, absolutely.
Our work is the way that we share whatever God has put into us with, we steward, to our previous, conversation a couple minutes ago about the definition of leadership. So
Yeah.
when you are helping someone to first understand that connection, how do you do that? What's some of the language or coaching that you might use to help people connect those dots?
Well, it's one of my favorite things because in my own faith journey, faith has been part of my life from a young age. I'm a pastor's kid. And so the mechanics of the church were very much a part of my life growing up. But I think my faith gained a new vibrancy when I began to gain a bigger imagination for the gospel and what it is. And so you have to start there. You just say, like, what is the scope of the effects of Christ's death and resurrection? And when you realize he's undoing the power of sin in every corner of creation and amplifying the goodness, the lived reality of God's kingdom in the world, you go, oh, that means every corner of creation, everything that I touch in my daily life is a place that is ripe for Christian influence, not necessarily pasting like a Jesus fish on, the cups at your company or
Right,
something like that.
right.
But thinking about, what does it mean that God's kingdom has come and is alive in this place? And so when you help a person sit with that, they suddenly gain a new imagination for their work. And I think that's fun. When my vision of the gospel expanded from being both personal to become more public, all of a sudden it was like shifting from being handed a box of 8 Crayola crayons, of being told, like, this is how you live the Christian life, to being handed a box of 64 crayons with a pencil sharpener on the back and say, like, there are innumerable ways you can color this picture of life with Christ. So let's talk about inviting you into this creative, imaginative process of seeing Christ at work where you are. And the beauty of that is that it'll help you love Jesus more because it expands your vision of how he's at work in your life and in the world.
Yeah. I love that. Really, what I hear you saying is invite people into imagine what it might look like if they considered what Jesus and what he's done for us, what that means for our work and for our lives beyond just Sundays and writing our tithe checks. Yeah.
I
That's
was talking to
so
a
good.
friend about a women in work group at a local church here in Denver, and she leads it and said, some of our women have actually said, I used to hate my job, and now I see it as a place of deep meaning. And I'm so thankful, for what this conversation, this group has meant for me.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. So the second challenge you talked about was kind of the complexity of life, right? If complexity and how do we balance, and the complexity of being a mom or a dad and aging parents. I'm living this right now. My mother has
Yeah.
been ill for the past year, and my husband had surgery last month. Like it's been, and I've got five adult children, but they're never not your children, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
there is a lot of complexity. And I often find myself thinking, wow, I'm so glad I'm not working in corporate America anymore because it was so hard to balance all of those things. And I don't know how I would do it. So I'm curious for folks that you guys interact with, that you interact with, what is the coaching or equipping that you're giving folks to say, here's some ways you can think about how you can do this effectively without kind of squelching your soul.
Yeah. I'm going to answer that in two ways. I'm going to give you the
Okay.
personal answer, and then I'm going to give you an answer for a Christian who's in a position of influence within an organization or a public policy space, because I think we need to acknowledge both. I
Yeah.
think from a personal perspective for a Christian, it's acknowledging that this just isn't a women's issue. For a long time it was, but
Yeah.
as we're seeing men increasingly step into caretaking roles, more meaningful, heavily involved caretaking roles with their families, this is a question for any worker, and that's so important to understand. This is an exception. This isn't an exception for certain people. It's just the norm that
Yeah.
anybody that works has a life outside of their work, and so they're having to figure out how do they integrate these tensions. Many people will have aging parents, as you referenced, and so those
Yeah.
caretaking responsibilities are very real. So the question is, what does it look like to see our different roles and responsibilities as integrated into this
Mm.
broad understanding of calling? Like, so often we
Mm.
think of calling as finding that one thing that God wants us to do. And calling really is a whole life response to God, meaning that we live with Him in all of life and for His purposes in all that we do. And so when you get this big idea of the gospel and life with God, it invites you to hold those pressures in tension. Now, it doesn't make it easy. It doesn't wave a magic wand over the rising cost of childcare and oppressive schedules and things that workers face. But it shifts your perspective from one of achieving this like elusive balance to saying, what does it look like to trust God with the tension and complexity of all these things that matter to Him and matter to
Yeah.
me? How do I hold them? And that means that we make some choices. It pushes us from stewardship into discipleship. We're saying, okay, Christ, what is the right way for me to respond in this situation? And it may mean making hard choices within
Yeah.
a family over the role that work will play or the way that you share responsibilities, or someone choosing for a season to dial up or down their career. It's not a formula, so I don't want to imply that there's a perfect thing to figure out, but it changes the types of questions that you're asking to best
Yeah.
honor the complexity of your responsibility. So that's like personal. And then, if there's someone that's listening who has the ability to shape their life within the organization, our system of working and family life is really broken here in the United
Mm.
States. Like in many places, childcare simply isn't affordable. Like here in Colorado, the cost of childcare for one child is twice what the US government says is a level of affordability. And so
Wow.
it's increasingly expensive to live in Denver and then to have that mix. So I think the reality of the childcare need, and that's not acknowledging lower wage earning workers.
Right.
It's crippling to think of and we saw that during the pandemic. It's
Yeah.
crippling for them to be able to both work, which we say is a common human necessity and good, and be able to raise families. So there's an opportunity for Christians who have influence in the life of an organization or in the life of our communities to lean into that, whether thinking about creative solutions for childcare, creating more flexible workplace policies.
Yeah.
One of the things I've loved is that we're seeing more American women involved in the workforce than ever, either part or full time. Almost 80% of American women are working, and that's the highest since the Labor Department began recording that statistic. So it creates an opportunity to say, hey, this isn't an exception here. This is the norm. So what does it look like to design a way of working that allows room for people to have families? Sometimes it can be as simple as flexibility in scheduling.
Yeah.
The work
Yeah.
from home transition was a really powerful one for women. So it doesn't mean that you only work from home, that you never expect somebody to come in, but just realizing that like quality of life outside of work improves when people have some schedule flexibility.
Yeah. And their productivity improves when they don't have all those other things that they're worrying about because they've got the flexibility to take care of those things. I think that's really well said. I love the connection you made, Joanna, between how we embrace kind of really what I heard was like there are different seasons and connecting that to calling. I really, this topic of calling, I think is a really interesting one because I hear so many people saying, I just need to figure out what God's calling is on me. What is his call for my life? And in the book you talk about this, and I wrote down the way you talked about it. You said a calling is a through line. It's an invisible thread that binds our story together across seasons and stages of life. I found that so freeing
Yes.
to say, discovering my calling isn't, here's what I kind of read. Discovering my calling isn't about, I'm going to journal until God says this is my calling. It's almost about stepping back and looking at the path, the arc of what's where he's led me and having that show me what the through line is.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit more about this idea of calling. Like
Yeah.
when somebody comes to you and says, I just need to figure out what God's calling is. How do give us some tools? Because a lot of us are
Yeah.
dealing with folks, or we ourselves are
Yeah.
having that thought.
Yeah, it's an
How should we
important
be thinking
question.
about that?
So I think what you do is you look at the grand narrative arc of scripture of creation,
Mm,
fall, redemption through Christ, and renewal. And you realize that anyone that is a human being lives within that framework. And anyone, especially that follows Christ, knows that their life in whatever stage, season, or role they're in fits within that framework. And so to some degree, we know what our marching orders are in a very general sense. It's to
yeah,
be living in intimacy with God, like the gospel restores this relationship with Christ, but it's to be living as agents of his kingdom wherever we are, however we are made, and whatever God's entrusted to us. And so
yeah,
in scripture, you see examples that are much more of a general invitation than specific. There are rare examples of God asking someone like Paul on the road to Damascus, or Mary at the Annunciation when she's told she'll carry the Christ. We see these examples of God breaking into history through Moses and the burning bush, but that actually isn't normative. That's a
yeah,
reflection of God at work throughout history, people that had a distinct role in the history of God or the nation of Israel. Like that actually isn't the norm for most people that follow Christ. We can have daily discernment of listening as God guides and leads, but this idea that he announces in advance what he's going to do, when we hold our breath waiting for that to happen, it actually is paralyzing it. And it
yeah,
keeps us from looking at all of the general things that God calls us um, into relationship with him, into the shared life of the church, into a common calling and baptism and identity and faith. There's so much more there about what a life of faithfulness looks like. Now, that's a very general answer to a question that we're trying to find specific solutions for, but that's where the daily discernment with God comes in, is that we live it out in our
yeah,
reality, and we trust God each step of the way rather than expecting him to make this bold pronouncement of the one thing he wants us to do. And that's
yeah.
very freeing. It
Yes,
also it pushes against some of our Americanness. Like we have this kind of American
yes.
exceptionalism where we think God has, this one purpose, this dream that's true for everyone. And I think, wow, the incredible invitation to life with Christ is pretty dreamy. Like it's powerful. And so we need to shift away from kind of our American vision of the ideal life, just to say, like, what does a faithful, impactful life look like on God's terms?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think it ties with another concept from your book that really resonated with me.
Mm.
And I want you to help connect the dot here. I think I connect the dot, but I want to hear how you connect the dot. You talk about this idea of vocational imagination.
Mm.
And in the book, that's the ability to adapt and envision new ways for God to work through our vocation. Connect the dot between that and what we just talked about with
Yeah.
calling.
Yeah. So if you see calling as this whole life response to God, and as someone that is whose personal life has been renewed through Christ, you become an agent of flourishing or renewal, a person who's realizing God's kingdom in the corner of life that you are. And that means every single one of us has different things that God has entrusted to us. It might
Yeah.
be our circle of relationships. It might be the platform we uniquely have in your job. Like the fact that you and I are podcasting today is evidence of a platform. It could be
Yeah.
a skill set or a trustworthiness. Amy Sherman, in her book, Kingdom Calling, Vocational Stewardship for the Common Good, describes that as vocational power, that every single one of us has been
Mm,
uniquely entrusted with a set of forms of influence or resources that we can uniquely use for God's purposes in the world. So part of the imagination starts with understanding who you are and what you have. And then
yeah.
the imagination is imagining what is broken and beautiful about the situation that you're currently in? Like, where are there
Mm,
opportunities to amplify God's goodness, beauty, and truth in the world? Some people are uniquely positioned in their jobs to have that kind of influence. So it's having an imagination in that space for what that looks like. Or it could be saying, what does it look like to address areas of brokenness within the
mm,
circles that you run in? We all have different circles. It could be something as small as the only thing you have the ability to control is your attitude and how you show up at work. And so
right.
you're going to respond to a broken environment with work through your response, through your personal presence in that place. Or it could be your leadership in a team. Maybe you sit in a more executive role within an organization and you're able to speak into the company culture and the way it moves. Or you may have influence that's outside of work. That could be just community
Yeah.
influence. Like I'm on the board of my HOA and I have to have imagination in that space, which it can be a really painful space to serve.
Yeah.
What does imagination as a Christian look like for being a person that brings life and relationship to a community
Mm,
based on the policies that we create for governing life together? So it's figuring out specifically, like getting down into the nitty gritties of where you are and saying, what are opportunities to amplify goodness and beauty and broken, or what are ways am I going to engage the brokenness that's here? It's an
yeah.
interesting conversation because when you actually start listing out practically how you see those two qualities of beauty and brokenness, you'll start being able to do that, and that's
Yeah.
important to actually get down into the
Mm.
substance of the work we do.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting. I'm making a note about the beauty and brokenness because I really think that's an important point. The other connection that I was making between the vocational imagination and the
Mm-hmm.
calling piece is the vocational imagination conjures for me this idea of, first of all, bloom where you're planted, which is kind of what I
Yes.
hear you saying, like allow God to use you in whatever space you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, almost I've been thinking a lot lately about career transition and kind of
Yes.
the career that we build over time and the career that God builds with us when we let him author that.
Mm-hmm.
And the vocational imagination of saying, I'm gonna adapt and I'm gonna move with the opportunities the Lord puts in front of me.
Exactly.
And all those together, all those mini assignments and roles, they
Mm-hmm.
make up they make up the expression of how I respond to my calling,
Yep.
that
We
general
often
calling.
refer to it like a string of pearls when we talked about the through line,
Mm,
is that it's
yeah,
not about finding that one thing you do for the rest of your life, but realizing that there are probably multiple seasons in any working person's life. And that extends to pre work and retirement. It's
yeah,
a lifetime of stewardship, and they may be very different, but chances are there's some commonalities of who you are or how you bring your unique skills to that place. And as you start to look more for what the through line is than the specific beads themselves, it can be really freeing and actually begins to bring coherence to your life. Or
yeah,
even the idea that calling is more likely formed in us over time than something
yeah.
that's found. Like common thinking is like, I've got to
Mm,
find that one thing. And that doesn't mean that you don't do skills testing or career coaching or sermon. That's part of the process.
yeah,
But you don't wait to find that perfect thing. You allow yourself to be formed in the different roles that you fill. And often when you look back on your life, you're like, oh, I really see how God has been preparing me for what I do now, that my calling
yes,
has been unfolding over years.
yeah. I love that. And I love the even that simple phrase of calling being formed, not
Mm-hmm.
found,
Yeah.
and I'm working on my first book and it's about different types of career transitions. And one of them that I call the confident stride.
Mm.
And it's most often towards the back half of your working
Yeah.
career where you hit this place where some of that all starts to come together and you realize something about how you're how God has been using you all along and
Mm-hmm.
forming you all along to go into a role that feels as if it was just perfectly designed for you and you walk so
Yeah.
confidently in it because God has created all of this readiness along the way,
Yeah.
especially when we've allowed the idea of vocational imagination to guide us and to allow ourselves to be used, right? So
Yeah.
it just
And
it's yeah.
there's suffering along the way too. I have to credit
Yes.
Todd Bolsinger from Fuller Seminary for that formed, not found framework. It's been life changing for me, because in my own vocational journey, as I look at my personal life and my professional life, they go hand in hand. I happen to be single and I'm in midlife. I'm somebody who always hoped to be married and
Mm.
never imagined that kids wouldn't be part of my life. But in my 40s, I had a real journey with medical issues that meant no longer being able to have kids and coming to terms with being single for longer than I imagined that I would be. And
Yeah.
both of those factors have been instrumental for me in what is an expression of my calling in this stage of leading women work and calling. I mean, I had leadership gifts that weren't welcome in the churches that I was
Mm.
worshiping at. And my life wasn't checking off the boxes of what I
Yeah.
thought a Christian woman should do. And so I needed answers for how to steward who I was, how to be faithful in who God made me to be. And that led me into the conversation around women in work. And turns out a whole lot of other Christian women who are not like me need that conversation too. In fact, I think anybody who faithfully walks with God needs to have a conversation about work because it's such a central part to our lives. And it's a beautiful
Yeah.
place. It offers a complete picture of life with God. So not to talk about it is leaving a gap in so many people's lives.
Yeah. That's really well said. And I think so often the church has kind of created this dividing line between, and not just the church has done this. I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
folks have done this. There's a dividing line between church and work. And that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about church where we come together or,
Yeah.
the body of Christ in general versus our work is it's just so fully integrated. That's why I
Yeah.
appreciate the movement that's happening. I
Mm-hmm.
see across the nation of the integration of faith and work, and so many more people talking about it now than were,
Yes.
20, 30 years ago.
And
And I
it's
know
such a
you
gift
guys
when we
are,
see faith communities. Oh, thanks. But it's
yes.
great to see faith communities, to see pastors who are just saying, hey, I need to get curious about this. I don't have to be
Yeah.
an expert in a corporate person's working life, but I can be curious
Yeah.
about their lived experience. And I can plan our services on Sundays with the worker in mind. Simple
Yeah.
shifts like that are profound.
Yeah. Yeah. And even thinking about, how what examples you highlight and when you're
Exactly.
teaching and things like that for sure. Yeah. Okay. My third concept from the book that I loved
Mm.
was this idea of being relationally generous.
Oh, yeah.
I just, it was that's such a beautiful expression of, well, let me just say this. I live in the Midwest. In the Midwest, people generally are relationally generous.
Mm.
We're
Yeah.
more relationally generous than what I see on the coasts for sure. And so sometimes to me, it feels a little odd that people wouldn't be relationally generous.
Mhm.
But I don't know that I had ever put words to that concept as succinctly as you have. And tell us about relational generosity.
Yeah.
What does it look like day to day? Maybe even for you. Like, how do
Mhm.
you express relational generosity?
I'm thinking of all the people that have modeled this for me.
Yeah.
So I think it's a spirit of, I think it's a very distinctly Christian way to live. Not that you won't see relationally generous people that don't have a faith background, but I think it's
Yeah.
a hallmark of a Christian person that we should be this way. And it's the
Mm-hmm.
idea that we see our relationships as and our resources as an asset to be shared. And so we enter any conversation or relationship with a commitment to being pursuing something that's mutually beneficial,
Yeah.
that it's not what can I get from this person, but a sense of giving and taking in any relationship. And also a sense of confidence and peace in who you are in Christ that allows you not to be territorial or defensive or
Yeah.
possessive. And that's still a learning curve for me, but I have experienced that from other leaders here in the Denver area. So I've lived over 30 years off and on in Colorado. And so I have a lot of social capital just because I've been here for a long
Yeah.
time. And one
Yeah.
of the things that has amazed me is seeing the community of leaders that we have here that are just present to each other and have very much a sense of like, we're in this together. What do I have that could serve you? And sometimes
Yeah.
that may be introducing to someone, like if you're at a nonprofit and you have someone that's a very major fundraiser for you, it's not being possessive about that person's generosity. You're trying to own it for
Right.
yourself and saying, you should meet my friend who's doing something that's aligned with values that you have across town. God will guide you in how to give. I don't need to act like I need to like cling on to and hold them. That's one example. But I
Yeah.
find that a lot is that I have to have healthy boundaries. That may be something that I struggle with for how God has made me. But I want to be a person who's a connector or who's
Yeah.
willing to make an introduction or who
Yeah.
shows up and has a sense of eagerness about what someone else is doing. It takes fleshing out in each person's personality and life, but it's a dynamic posture for how you show up as a person of faith in the world.
Yeah.
And I think it's super important for women.
Yeah.
Um, we
It
need
real
yeah, I think a lot of women show up in the women working calling space and say they want mentors. And I think they use the word mentor because what they really want is they want wisdom and relationship in their life. And that's the only word they have for it. But really, if we were more relationally generous and available to each other to learn together and support each other, it changes what need for mentoring looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that at the core of this concept of relational generosity is it's the same thing at the core of any type of generosity. It's
Mm-hmm.
we trust that God is providing for us. We trust that God has all that we need. So it's good for us to give away
Yeah.
our wisdom, our resources, our connections,
Yeah.
our insight and our money. That's what everybody talks about when we think about generosity is just
Right.
finances. But I love this idea of we have so many resources available to us through all the things that you mentioned, whether it's connections or insight or wisdom or knowledge or experience. Or I have found one of the most powerful things for folks who are kind of career searching is to go
Yeah.
ask other people to tell them about their career path.
Yes. Or being
It's
willing
such
to
as
make an introduction to someone if they want to work at a company and you might have a connection there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the more that you, it's interesting. I find that when you invite people to be relationally generous, many times they will respond, even if they
Yeah.
don't necessarily regularly practice it. But when I reach out to someone and say, I just want to know about your career, tell me about your career, or tell me about the things that you're dealing with right now, or tell me about your journey with your aging parent, or tell me about your journey with, walking through life, wanting to be married, but being single. And what did God teach you about that? Like when we invite people to be relationally generous, oftentimes they are.
Mm-hmm.
And for us being as, especially as faithful leaders, being like conscious of opportunities to
Mm-hmm.
be relationally generous, not just
It's
with the people
yeah.
younger than us, or it happens all the time, every day.
Good things will come to your life when you choose to be
Yes.
relationally generous. It is
Yes.
good for your career and well beyond that to have that
Yeah.
posture towards others.
Yeah. Yeah. Truly. All right. So we're almost wrapped up. I have two more questions for you. One is, where is God challenging you right now in your leadership? You lead a pretty sizable platform that I think is growing.
Yeah, it is.
Tell us a bit about where God is challenging you.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that this morning. Um, so it has been such a gift to be at Denver Institute for the last 10 years. And Women Working Calling has grown over about a decade. And over the last 5 years, since we went online in the pandemic, suddenly we just have had this growing national audience of women. But one of the challenges is that it has grown through a whole lot of hustle and
Mm,
overwork. And we've just reached a point that um, it can't function anymore with me being a solopreneur. And that's not to say there haven't been like circles and circles of people that have been part of this conversation with
yeah.
me, but we've reached a point where my leadership has to grow to be able to develop and empower others. And that process is underway. But whoa, it's just also really painful because you're in that in between
Mhm.
point where you have a lot of emerging leaders, but aren't quite there and you're still trying to hold
Yeah.
on to what you have. And so balancing workload and also just having a real generosity and ability to empower others is right where it's at. I think that's common for folks that lead growing initiatives. So I know I'm not alone, but like, whoa, it's really hard.
Yeah, I think that is such a challenge, and I remember being in places like that and
Mm-hmm.
trying to remind myself like Jesus didn't do what he did alone as a solopreneur. He
Mm-hmm.
had these 12 emerging leaders that he invested in, who then invested in other people, and that's how movements grow. That's how impact
Yes.
really happens, and it's tough because there is a almost an innate kind of self-protection in a lot of us that we have to push past, or that's
Yeah.
especially for entrepreneurs. I know I went through a phase of like, but this is my baby. Like, if you don't take care of my baby the way I want you to take care of my baby, but then realizing over time, the more that you do let folks in
Yeah.
and empower them, equip them, make sure that they've got the resources that they need and
Mhm.
the input they need, the training they need, the vision, all of those things. But the more that you do that, actually, things will tend to expand far
Yeah.
beyond what you could imagine on your own. So
And the
that's
ideas
a
will get better
cool,
because you have more of them. I mean, it's exhausting to
exactly.
be in the center and think all ideas have to come from you. So, but it's a shift. It's a shift out of that. And
Yeah.
I think successful growing organizations have to make that shift or they don't survive.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't replicate, they don't grow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Healthy things are always growing and replicating and reproducing, which only happens if there's more than just one person
Yeah,
running
exactly.
the show, for sure, for sure. So, last question, how can we stay in tune with what you guys are doing? Where
Oh,
can we follow
yes.
you? Are there some upcoming things
Yeah.
happening that we should be aware of? That type of thing.
Especially for folks that are outside of Colorado. It's one of the gifts of getting to be in conversation with you. So you can find us at denverinstitute.org is the website. And we excel at creating digital resources, whether it's podcast content or discipleship guides or devotionals or articles, lots of things that could serve people outside of the Denver area. You can also find the specific work I'm leading at womenworkandcalling.com and
Okay.
something to mark your calendars for. This fall, November 7th, is our annual event. Last year, we had 1,300 women all over the country from live stream from Denver involved. And so we're in the process of recruiting people to lead host sites. So if you want to have a
Awesome.
group of women experiencing that in your community, we're here to help you with that. And, we created like a little digital discussion guide which goes with my book. It's free on the Women Work and Calling website. Do a summer book club. It's super easy to
Yeah.
lead. Our goal is to make it easy for women to be developing women. And so there's lots of tools available to you.
Awesome. All of that is very exciting. We will put links to the the Denver Institute. We'll put links to Women Work and Calling on the show notes. So if anybody's interested in those, we'll put a link to the book as well. This has been such a fun conversation. I'm so
Mm-hmm.
inspired and very energized by the work that you are leading,
Mm-hmm.
both the Women Work and Calling work as well as the Denver Institute. Just
Yeah.
such an important body of work, and you're impacting the kingdom in a really significant way.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks. It's been such a gift just to have this season of living my calling be at Denver Institute. So, what a joy to journey with you and invite you into what God's doing.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much, Joanna. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Ann.
Well, that was such a rich conversation with Joanna Meyer. I hope that you are walking away as encouraged and inspired and maybe a little bit challenged as I am as well. Here's my three key takeaways, as always, that I encourage you to think about and maybe think about how you can reapply them. I loved the conversation about calling being formed, not found. This is a question I get so often. How do I figure out my call? And the conversation with Joanna was so helpful to remind us that calling isn't something that we discover, it's something that God is cultivating in us. Our general call is very broad. Our call as Christians is very broad, but we need to kind of stop waiting for the lightning bulb moment to strike us on this topic of calling. Let's reflect on the roles and the relationships and the experiences that God's already used to shape us, and ask him, hey, where have I seen you? Where have you been forming me through my work and through my life? That's how we actually get to calling, not some treasure that we need to dig up and discover. It's we're forming it. God is forming it in us over time. Second takeaway was this concept of vocational imagination. I really love this concept of vocational imagination. And if you were intrigued by that too, I encourage you to pick up Joanna's book and read a little bit more about it. But wherever you are, whether you're in a boardroom or a classroom, construction site, your own kitchen, you've been entrusted with some kind of influence. And what beauty can I amplify in whatever situation I'm in? What brokenness can I bring light into wherever I'm planted? That's the idea of vocational imagination, imagining how God might use us in whatever role we happen to be in. Third takeaway was this topic of relational generosity, which I think is pretty common here in the Midwest for folks that are here in the Midwest where I am. But really, I love the way Joanna talked about relational generosity as kind of being leadership in action, right? Like one of the most powerful ways that we can lead is by opening doors for others. This week, make one introduction, offer one word of encouragement, share a piece of wisdom that you've learned the hard way. Generosity isn't just financial, it's relational. Love that concept. So here's my challenge for the week. I really want you to take 15, 20 minutes to reflect on what Joanna referred to as your string of pearls, the seemingly unrelated moments in your life and in your work that God might be weaving into a bigger picture that He's using to form who you are. What's the through line that you see, and how might it shape your next step? Hey, if you want to learn more about Joanna and the Women Work and Calling initiative, you can go to womenworkandcalling.com. Be sure to check out her book, Women Work and Calling. We've linked it in the show notes. You can visit those to get all of these links. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with a friend or with a colleague. Be relationally generous and share it with somebody, maybe somebody who you know is navigating through calling or leadership or career navigation or career transition. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps other faith-led leaders to find us. And until next time, keep leading with faith and growing with purpose. And I will look forward to seeing you again very soon.